working okay because I put it on. I sent it this morning, I think. I forgot which name I gave. Go to download maybe. No? No, not really. Ah, yeah. Okay, here it is. Yeah? Okay, okay. Thank you. No, please, no. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm going to talk to you about, it's not very recent work, but I had a discussion with Anuj, and I think many of you were interested in questions around water and urban development. So I'm going to try to put together a few things that I've been working on. You will see it's more, I would like it to be much more interactive than being a lecture. This is not a class, so it's more of an open discussion. So whenever something is not really clear or you want to ask me a question, you please feel free. I don't want to do 40 minutes of speaking non-interrupted. I'll be rather happy if you want precisions or things that you think I've not talked about, which will be the case since water is a very important subject and a very diverse subject. So I've tried to bring some point forward, not all of them. So either we can have a discussion in between or at the end, as you like. Yeah, thank you. So it's just to give you an idea of the structure of the presentation. It's always easier, I think, if you know where I'm going to go or what I'm going to try to say. Of course, I'm going to give you some key elements of context and why I think water supply is a very interesting subject. I also did not realize that you are in economics. I also did my MPhil in economics, and some of my earlier work was much more, in fact, my PhD on water was in economics. But the way I didn't think of it this way, so the presentation I'm making has nothing to do with economics, but of course, if you have more precise questions which are related to the economics of it, I hope I will be able to answer it. I just will present some facts and data. They are not very updated. Actually, the idea is not to present to you the most recent data. You also know that there's been no census since 2011. So for some data, it's becoming very complicated to measure. I could have looked for more recent data, but I think the idea is just to put some point forward about what data tell us. Then there's a spelling mistake. I'm going to talk a little bit about the legal and the policy framework when we look at water supply in India. And I wanted to insist mainly today on the question of mechanism of exclusion, especially since the subject I decided to talk about was on the right to the city. And then just a conclusion about, how we can advance the question of the right to the city. I just made a series of questions that can be put to debate. There are many more, but I didn't want to make it too heavy and overcharged. So I'm going to start with the introduction. No. Oh, you don't? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, no, I don't know. I thought this slide, I hope you have the good version. Anyway, so just to tell you that when we look at a sectoral issue, it's also open up larger questions, right? Here, my idea, and I've worked on various urban services. I've worked on water, but I also work on sanitation, solid waste, and more recently, as Anuj was saying, I've been working on energy. I think it's a very heuristic way to look at larger questions. Some of them I will not discuss today, but as I said, we can open up later, which is the material transformation of urban spaces that you yourself see every day in the cities where you live or the city you come from. The shifting of urban power relations, often access to services gives us a good idea of who are the actors, what is the relationship between the citizen and the policymakers, the expression and the reconfiguration of new cultural and social norms, which is very important for water as well. Of course, water has very strong symbolic dimension, which is important in designing policies, and the imagined visions of the city and historical continuities. Some of these subjects, as I said, are much more in my larger work on urban services, but this is important to understand that even when you took a small subject, and especially, I'm going to improvise a little bit, but now that I know that you are mainly student of economics, it is very important, and that's often what we are not taught in economics, is that there is much more than question of efficiency, pricing, equilibrium, but that these questions of what is the vision of what we want to do, how we understand power relationship, how we understand social norms are as important, most probably, as some of more economic-driven work. As I said, the census data, I will show you a few small numbers. I don't know if you have a course on urban economics. Is there a course in urban economics? Okay, so I have decided, I didn't know, but I will show some data on urbanization. And clearly the census show that there's been an improvement in access, and in particular in sanitation. I'm not going to spend much time on sanitation, but we can come back to it. But there are many dimensions of inequalities that remain very strong, and that the level of services remain very low. So for instance, I've not looked at the most recent data, but Delhi still has, at least 5-6 years ago, Delhi still had half of its population without water supply in their house. It seems very difficult to believe it when you live in Delhi, but this is actually the case. That remains the case today. So this means that all ethnographic work, qualitative work actually show that the level of services remain very low. And that's a key question, of course, on how you can improve access to services. So that was just to introduce the subject. Next. So the next section, as I said, is really to talk about inequalities and vulnerabilities. As I said, I'm going to use all data, but all data are based on census. We don't have much more recent. Of course, there are the data that are linked to the Joint Management Program, which is the following up of the Sustainable Development Goals on water supply and sanitation, which you can have a look at. Next, the main thing when we look at urban services in India, even in the largest city, right, there is still no universalization of services. You still have people who do not have basic services, be it water, electricity, or sanitation, or even solid waste. And the idea that 100% of the population should have access to water, to basic services, I think remain and should remain a very important role for policymakers. So as I said, these are data from the census 2011. Hopefully there will have been a jump. I think there's been quite a lot of investment. But we are still waiting for this government to one day decide that a new census will be useful for knowledge about Indian society. Hopefully it should come soon, we don't know. But if you look at the access to water, for instance, you can see that if you first look at access to water, there seems to be not too much of a difference between urban population and urban slums population. Because access means that you have water within 200 meters of your premises, right? But when we look at access to water within premises, which means water coming to your house, you clearly see that there is a huge difference between the percentage of urban population having access, around 71%. I think it would be higher today, and 56% for the urban slums, right? If you look at the number with toilet within premises, exactly the same kind of gap. And lack of toilets, as you see within premises, is very high in urban slum, around 34%. And open defecation remained in 2011 quite high, almost 20%. Might have decreased clearly with SBM, the Swachh Bharat mission. But this is just to remind, as economists, sometimes we tend to use averages, but to remind you of the very strong differences between the types of settlement, considering also that urban slums is a category which is very diverse, that can include also unauthorized colony that varies according to state, varies according to city, and can cover actually a large share of the population. So for instance, in Mumbai, the numbers are around 50% of the population is officially living in slums. So it's not small numbers of people, of course. The second point, yes, please. Thank you, sorry, is to show, nevertheless, that there's been really a significant improvement. Of course, this is 2001, 2011. I'm not too happy to show you this data, but as I say, we don't have much more. And you can see, do I have something to point? Or? No? We don't have point. Okay, so can you hear me if I come closer to here? Right? Okay. You have. Okay. Okay, thank you. Here it's 2001, and this is the darker states, which is really below 50% of people having water in their houses. And you can see that, for instance, it's shifting, right? A larger share is moving towards 90 to 100% here. So there's clearly been an improvement. Similarly, far from noticed, but noticed, they use a lot of natural spring and natural sources, which explain also the fact that there is less access to water in house. But you see the progress, but it's still a low progress. And as you can see, these maps also show the large disparities according to states, right? So for instance, you can see that the north, Punjab, etc., or even Gujarat, Kerala have better water supplies. Kerala is not north, of course. But regional disparities are also very important to take into account. Next is the city size. I wanted to show this data because often when we think of urban development in India, we think only of the large cities. Some of the work that I've been doing, I did not present this work, but which is Anuj mentioned, which is called Subaltern Urbanization, has been looking at cities below 100,000 people. And very clearly, this is a large share of urbanization. In fact, almost 50% of the people living in cities in India live in cities or in urban settlements which are below 100,000 people. And this is very important to understand that urbanization is not necessarily linked to big cities. Now, this data is what shows that the differences in terms of access, you have more than water here, you have also electricity. But if you look at in-house latrine, you can see that it varies from 67% for smaller city to 86% for larger cities. And sewage system is is a very telling number. That is again in 2011. Yeah, it's working. You can hear me. 2011 is very clear connection to sewage. You can see the difference according to the size of the city. Of course, it's linked to the type of investment. Similarly, with in-house tap and in-house water access, right? So once again, it's just to pinpoint what I want to do with this data is to remind you of the kind of inequalities that exist and the level of equipment that vary very strongly according to the city size. In the work I've done on Right to the City, but I didn't want to, I tried to mix different work to talk about urban water. There is also a lot of qualitative work that gives us a lot of precisions and much more, I would say, rooted or situated knowledge of the type of vulnerabilities. Of course, you know them. In economics, it's often called as anecdotal, right? When you have a large qualitative survey, but they often tell us a lot about the type of vulnerabilities. One of them is, of course, women. I think there's a lot of work. So census data will not necessarily give you numbers about our access of water to women, but there is a large body of work on the fact that women have to carry water, have to wait at the points of water. They had to wait when tankers arrived. They had to wait when at the public fountains, at the public hand pumps. And in my PhD work, actually, I didn't think about it, but now it comes back to me. I did try to calculate the economic cost of time, because this is a huge amount of time that is spent on doing this. There is also a large body of work on women and sanitation. I think you are aware of it, of the fact that no access to toilet lead to violence towards women. There is also a lot of issues with how you go to the toilet, whether you have to go in group. That it's actually it's a very intimate form of violence on women, the fact of not having access to toilet. And it also translates to children, with many schools, for instance, not having water supply or not having toilets, which means that girls will have to miss number of days, for instance, young girls, because when they have their menstrual cycle, well, they cannot go to the school. Children are also often the ones who are going to fill the buckets at the hand pumps. All these are hidden economic costs. I'm trying to speak to economists, so I'm changing what I was trying to do. But so a lot of work on vulnerable groups, of course, as well on religious lines. Segregation is higher around caste and religious lines in middle-ranked cities. And that, of course, translates also into very strong inequalities. I had students who did his PhD on this question. And we did some work also on subaltern urbanization, clearly showing that often the piped network even though the pipe network is somehow a leveler of inequalities, can still reach some pockets of the cities, of the small cities that are usually the better off, and therefore leave aside the most vulnerable group, the weaker caste or religious minorities. This is just to put forward the importance of looking at sometimes of very basic sectoral issues, right? As economists, we tend to look at budget. I think you have a panel on budget later in the day, right? At macroeconomic data, but this is actually something that actually has a very major impact on people's life and therefore people's productivity in many ways. Yeah, we can move. So because I wanted to present to you this work on urban water and right to the city, in this, of course, I looked at the legal and policy framework. I hesitated while preparing this lecture whether I should go back to the history of urban policies in India. So I decided against it, but I'm still going to talk about it a little bit, about the legal and policy framework, and I called it inclusive without putting it in bracket, because that's most probably one of the strong, according to me, but I might be wrong, but one of the strong contradictions that can be seen between policy framework, which are designed to be inclusive, which have a lot of policy enunciations or policy imagination of providing water to everybody, or making sure that solid waste is collected, that solid waste workers will be treated correctly, that there is going to be improvements in the labor conditions, and the reality, which I will talk about later. So I'm going to take some water. So just to place a little bit the question, there's been a lot of proactive policies in the urban sector. I would say since 1994 was the 74th Amendment. That was not, of course, only related to urban questions. It was also rural decentralization. But since the beginning, in the middle of the 90s, really there's been a very strong push. In fact, I think we can almost argue, and I think I do argue that in some of my papers, that the urban became a national project in many ways, that becoming urban and transforming cities and making sure that cities were efficient because they were the engines of growth became a very, very important policy directions, which I think, of course, with variations, and we can talk about that between the UPA or the Congress and the NDA and the BJP, of course, different visions maybe of what should be centralized, decentralized, the relationship between center and state, but overall a similar approach to what should be the urban policies. So very ambivalent policies till the beginning of the 80s. And what Darshini Mahadevia, who is a very important scholar in urban studies, called a bridging period, where there was suddenly a rise of concern about urban services, especially in 1988, the National Commission on Urbanization actually raised for the first time really clearly the importance of having good urban services in cities. And since the 90s, but I'm trying to summarize, of course, we can discuss a bit at length later, really the idea that you could transform the governance with the idea of decentralization. You know that, I think the 74th Amendment, 73rd and 74th for the urban question. Commercialization, private sector participation, which became a very strong mantra. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I've worked a lot on private sector participation in water supply as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have on this. And public sector reforms with a very strong influence of the new public management policy, which means that public sector should follow much more managerial norms in the way it provides services. And very strongly, I think, influence of neo-institutional economics. So I guess you have classes on institutional economics or not? No? Only Quant? But I think institutional economics, and especially neo-institutional economics, has been majorly important in the 90s and in the 2000s. And I think it shaped very much the manner in which thinking was done in India, as you know. So then let me spend 2-3 minutes on this then. As you know, Manmohan Singh was working in the World Bank. So did, not Ishar, what's his name? Ahluwalia, the husband of Ishar. Montek Singh Ahluwalia was also in the World Bank. So was someone like Rakesh Mohan, who wrote a big report in 1997 on commercialization of urban services. All of them had been in the World Bank at a time when the idea was making institutions work. So a lot of the focus was on this idea of how you make institutions work, which is, of course, the root of neo-institutional thinking, whether you think of Douglas North or, I don't know, you study Douglas North? Williamson, Ronald Coase, all, yeah. Yeah, so I think all this field of economics really shaped actually the thinking of how urban reforms should be done. So it's just to give you an idea. I think now it's a very different. I mean, it might be slightly different. There is less idea about how to fix institution in the new ways of thinking in the recent years, but that was very strong. And I'm not going to talk about all of this, but this, as I said, I put it here so that we can open up for questions later. Next. So now coming back to water, of course, in India, and I take a small. There is a national water policy framework, but to some extent, this national water policy framework is not very relevant to understand urban water supply, because it's more of a national framework which looks at sharing of resources, priorities, for instance, between residential, industrial, agricultural uses, discusses also inter-basin transfer or conflicts between states. So in some sense, when we look at the water supply sector, it's not very easy to understand how it pans out in cities and what are the policies, because the framework, the national framework, is not very, very focused on the urban question, right? So what is the most important when we want to understand this sector is really to look at the policy instruments and the public policies that are much more determining. I don't know if this is correct English, actually. But yeah, they have a much more impact than the national water policy, right? Now, the question of the right to water, which I started with, since this is the title of the, is really is not in the Indian Constitution. There's also been a lot of debate internationally on the question of the right to water, but it's indirectly implied in the right to life and liberty, Article 21 of the Indian Constitution. And again, many NGOs or movements have been tried to put down a certain number of reforms. And I can tell you, for instance, later if you want, just pointing towards that about the prepaid water meter in Mumbai, for instance, which I followed very closely at the time when it was planned to be implemented. And it was shut down because there was an appeal by NGO on the right, on the basis of the right to life and liberty and the right to livelihoods, out of which you could indirectly discuss the right to water. So the right means really you can make a claim to the state, and the state has a duty, in some sense, to deliver the basic services to you. Water is a state subject, so I guess, again, that you must be knowing the distribution of subjects according to the constitutional arrangement. So for water, it's a state subject, and it's also one of the responsibility of the 12th schedule. It's one of the 12th schedule of the 74th constitutional amendment. So some states, so again, it's very diverse and very varied. Some states have defined water policies. In some cases, decentralization has happened. This is the case, for instance, in Madhya Pradesh, which I think is one of the only states where all the municipalities and urban local bodies are in charge of water supply. But in many other places, water supply remains in the hands of the state through parastatal. This is the case for Delhi, for instance. Delhi water supply is managed by the Delhi Jal Board and not at the level of the municipality. This is the case for many large cities like Bangalore, like Hyderabad. Among the big cities, I think only Mumbai and Calcutta have this responsibilities managed by the urban local body itself. Why I'm saying this, it raises question, of course, because then the political economy of water supply then shifts between the local and the state, right? Officially focus on the supply to all. And as I said, most of these policies have a very inclusive discourse about everybody should have 24 hours water supply and all the households should have 24 hours water supply. But the implementation of a set of reform are actually going very much, I would say, not making the investments in this direction. And as I said, a very institutional approach. Can move forward. So now I wanted to talk about the existing mechanism of exclusion. Some of them, of course, there is much more than that, and we can discuss this, and most of you will have some experience. Water is something we all deal with in our daily life, and so we all have anecdotes about it. But I wanted to discuss about some of them, and actually maybe they are the right ones to discuss for economy students. First, legal and administrative procedure. Okay, so even if you have, let's say, an inclusive policy, or you decide that I want to provide water supply to everybody, access to being able to just make a claim, because right to the city is really this idea that I make a claim, I'm a citizen, this is my right to have a certain level of service, right? Needs a legal tenure and property document in most cases. Some cities have tried to make it a bit more flexible, like Odisha, for instance, has made a disconnect between land tenure and being able to apply for water. But of course, for a large number of slums, unauthorized colony, ability to prove that you have a right to land tenure or that you have property documents. I don't know if you know about Delhi, but Delhi has, I don't know how many legal dates, like you can show that you arrived before this date and then before this date. And all schemes have different dates of property or documents to show. You have to prove that you've been here for so long before you're even able to apply for a water connection. There's also a lot of difference between slums on private and public land. So I don't know where you are all coming from, but when we are in Delhi, we don't think about it because Delhi is mainly public land. So most of the slum on public land. But if you take a city like Mumbai, you have a large number of slum on private land. So even if Mumbai Municipal Corporation is developing some schemes directed to slums which are on public land, these are very difficult to apply on private land or even on railway land, on district land. Land tenure is very varied, very complicated in the Indian setup. You know it more than me. And so this is a very strong mechanism of exclusion. A large number of people cannot just apply for a water connection, a regular water connection, simply because they are located in places where this is kind of illegal in some sense. Of course, illegal is the term used by the, let's say, decision makers, not the term I would use, and because you don't have the property document. A second and very important aspect that exclude people from claiming their right is lengthy and complex procedure. So I remember I was rereading the document I wrote on water and right to the city, and I think it was an example from Puri in Odisha. You needed, I think, 10 or 12 steps to be able to apply for water connection, right? Various levels of documentation, and you need to go to the assistant engineer, then you have to go to executive engineer or superintendent engineer, executive engineer. So the importance of knowledge, knowing how to do it, creates a very strong gap between, of course, those who have a certain level of education, who are located in planned colonies versus the other. I would say that, of course, this has slightly changed with the rapid deployment of IT solutions. And of course, now you can apply for a new connection online. Many of these procedures have been facilitated. But this facilitation, which is a very major turn in Indian, in fact, Anuj is holding in his hand the PhD of my student on digitalization in Bhubaneswar, and it's very impressive in 10 years how many functions of urban services have been digitalized. But digital literacy is still very structurally biased, and not everybody can do that. So that's, again, a very strong mechanism of exclusion. The role of intermediaries is being increased. I think this is a very important, I didn't plan to spend too much time on it, but one of the fundamentals premises of the neo-institutional approach pushed by the World Bank, which in 1994 published its World Development Report on urban services, was the idea that if you make new public management-oriented reforms, you would get rid of all intermediaries. You would actually increase transparency, you would increase accountability, and it would be a much more direct compact or social contract, if you want, between citizen or beneficiary and the state. What we realize, in fact, in reality, when we do field work and when we do much more ethnographic work, is that because of all these processes of exclusion, you need to rely on intermediaries in many colonies. Of course, not if I'm sitting in, in a good colony where I can just apply online for a connection. And so the role of elected representative, local councillors, MLA is very influential in being able to get services in my neighborhood, right? Now, the influence of a local councillor can vary, or an MLA can vary for many reasons. I mean, he's aligned with the party in charge. He's been working there for 20 years, for 25 years. He knows very well the functioning of the administration. And is able during budget discussion to say, no, I want here, I need water here, I need to invest here, right? So it can create a very disparate geographies. Means that even if you look at poorer neighborhoods in Indian cities, it's not always that you think that slums will have very less water supply than unauthorized colonies. Sometimes it can be diverse. So these intermediaries play a big role. What you call social workers, of course, anthropological literature, I looked very much at social worker. Whenever you go to the field, you hear many people telling you I'm a social worker. Social worker can mean many things, can be just working as an assistant to a local councillor, can be a small private goon, can be actually a real estate person engaged as well in what it calls social work. It can range from a very large number of functions, right? Which means that actually with this intermediation, which is very strong, we are moving from the idea that providing a service is a favor and not a right. And that's a very strong difference to make when we talk about the right to the city, right? As a citizen, I have a right to a certain number of services, but for a large number of citizens, this is not a right that I can claim. This is a favor that I can negotiate. And this is the story of Indian urban governance. That's why water is very useful to understand governance, which means whatever we call informal, negotiated governance, informal arrangements, you need to rely on many different leverages to be able to have access. It's the same to have access maybe to a ration card, similar work which shows the same thing, access to solid waste, access to sanitation. And this means that you really have, if I want to make the link between right to the city, urban services, and citizenship, many people have written, and we have done it in this work on right to the city, a form of graduated citizenship. You have a number of citizens in Indian cities who have a full urban citizenship. They can claim their services. And you have those who have a kind of, second rate, I mean, this is not really the term to use, but a much lower level of citizenship because they can't claim as a right, they claim as a favor. And this is the famous work of Partha Chatterjee that you all know, I hope, or you should, even if he's not an economist, but on this distinction, right? Favor versus right. Next. Yeah, so this is just an example, but I don't know how much more time I have. How much more time I have? Around 20 minutes? Really? Oh, then I have a lot of time. This is just an example. This was a master's student of mine who is now a full researcher, so I was very happy. He did a very interesting work. This was just because I think it shows the diversity, okay? This was work that he did during his, you can hear it works? Yeah. Yeah. During his master, he came to Mumbai. At that time, I was working in Mumbai, living in Mumbai. And it is just a very small slum, okay, in Mumbai, which had no water supply because, they were on the illegal land. So the municipal corporation was not able to provide them water supply. Because Mumbai is a rather proactive city in terms of providing services. The reason being not necessarily that. Something is missing here. No, it's maybe later. Just show me the next one. Yeah, okay. Then go back to my. I was wondering or something. Because they are very worried about water mafia. So they are trying to improve water supply in slums so that it reduces to some extent the role of water mafia, what they call water mafia. Water mafia, of course, being linked to a large extent to a number of political leaders in the city. So let's say this is the slum, it's actually on a hill. So that's also why it's not so easy to provide water supply. So actually there's an arrangement, a kind of informal negotiated arrangements that there's a very large water pipe down the slums that the municipality let the various groups within the slums to connect. So they allow and they kind of supervise the nature of the connection, the technical engineering of the connection to make sure that there's not too much leakage, etc. It's nowhere written in the policy, of course, it's all informal. This is part of what Ananya Roy called the informal state, right? And then why I wanted to show you is that because he's done a very interesting work of looking at various pockets of the slum, okay? And for instance, when it's very orange, it means the politicization of the group is very strong. They are very politically organized, and in some cases you see it was Congress or that's NCT, I think, different political parties. Right? And according to, and for instance here, there's very little politicization because are the latest people who have arrived in these slums. They are usually migrants. Okay, so they have very little political engagement. And Shiv Sena, sorry, National Congress Party. And we see here the ones which have very little politicization, of course, no political affiliation because they are the poor migrants. And here there is one pocket which is totally commercial, which means it's one person who has created it's a small private entrepreneur. He's the one who's making the connection to the houses and is charging for them. While here it's very much under the influence of political parties and the ability of political parties to get people together. And similarly, there is also one area where it's an NGO which has started working in Islam. So one pocket is provided by the NGO. Some of them is politically mediated with a lot of competition, and as I said, one is with a private entrepreneur. So it's almost like small commons in some sense. I mean, not really commons in the sense that we understand it in economics, of course, but different modes of management and financial systems of these pockets within the slum. In some of them, it's more democratic, with a very community-based kind of discussion that who gets water, at what time, how much you pay, with a system that maybe some groups will pay less than others. In some of them, it's very leader-based. There's one person who's taken the lead and provides the water. It's the way it's organized. And in one case, it's even predatory with a commercially based system. So why I chose to present this example is simply to go back to the point that I was saying, that even though there are very structural mechanisms of exclusion, like property document, legal tenure, documentation, the fact that when we are working in an urban environment, we are working in a space with social norms and political mediation. So for instance, if people belong to the same religion, same group, they might find their own ways of organizing, and that actually it's a lot of diversity within a larger structural framework of exclusion. Next, this leads to the question of affordability of services, of course, which is, I guess, the bread and butter of economics and economists and young economists like you, of course. As I said very much in my introduction, the percentage of households with an in-house connection remains very low. And one of the reasons it's the cost, it's expensive, right? So the first expensive feature, which I think now is slightly changing because a lot of cities have understood that, is the connection fees, which is very, very expensive, right? And in some sense, if you think of it as an economist, it is a perverse subsidies, right? Because those who got connection, let's say 30, 40 years ago, in the city center, they got it cheap. Right now, you expand the network, it is costly. You need to make, you need to get the connection fee higher to take into account the cost of expanding the network. And these are the new arrivals, and especially the periphery, which have to pay high connection fees. So for instance, in Buenos Aires, there was a huge social movement against this. And similarly in Bangalore, because there was the feeling that you live in peri-urban areas, you have a lower level of services, and actually you have to pay much more for your connection fees. So some cities now have started to think about reducing, or you can pay in various installments, and tariffs. Of course, tariffs, it's a complicated question because tariffs are not very high on average in Indian cities for water supply. And if ever any of you have looked at any work on economists on water tariff, they will tell you tariff is low. Tariff need to be increased. But tariffs embody very clearly the tension between economic efficiency and social equity. So ensuring pricing of water, of course, is important to avoid a low vicious circle, right? I don't pay for my water, I have no revenue. I have no revenue, I cannot invest. I cannot invest, I have low quality of water. I don't want to pay. Right? It's a very vicious circle. Nevertheless, the argument of just increasing water tariff, I think, needs to be looked at it much more carefully, because there is an inbuilt possible regressive effect of increasing block tariff, which is very often the type of tariff which is used in India. And I give you an example, simple example for you to think about it. But for you, this is easy to understand. You're economists, you know it by heart. If I am a poor household, very often I will share a connection with maybe a set of 5 or 6 families, right? If I have an increasing block tariff, I will move from the lowest block to the higher block, right? So finally, my average price per cubic meter might be actually higher than if I were in the lower strata, right? The lower block. So there's a lot of inbuilt regressive tariff effect that are often not studied enough. And that's also a factor of exclusion. So I think when we think of subsidies, we need to think not as a consumer of water, which has been very much the thinking of the last 20 years, but very much of the question of the beneficiary and the citizen. And for instance, another impact that a lot of policies, in particular, some of them linked to providing 24-hour water supply or privatized water supply or reform water supplies, have tended to suppress public taps and fountains or public hand pumps, because then you can't count, right, the water. It's much more difficult to have an accountability of the number of cubic meter. But these are the best subsidies for the very poor. I mean, it's free, okay, they don't pay for water, but actually they are not going to consume 200 liters a day. They'll consume what they need, right? And this has been traditionally a very efficient subsidies that has disappeared from the Indian cities, and this is something to think about. I'm not telling you one should do this or one should do that. I'm just saying that when we think of this discussion around prices and what is an affordable services, we need to take into account all of this. Similarly, very often water experts will say, oh, water price has to be increased. Energy people will say, oh no, electricity is too cheap, it has to be increased. Then, oh no, but we might need to pay for sanitation. And very often, because you have very sectoral thinking, you also forget the bundle of rights. And that if this is not only affordability for water, it's affordability for this bundle of rights that should be the basic services. Inequalities are also reinforced, and again, I'm not spending time on this, by compensatory strategies. In fact, that was my PhD. I spent a lot of time doing this, which means that my water supply is very low. Okay, what do? I install tankers, I install bore wells. Most of the very wealthy colony in Delhi will have tankers and a well, right? But in proportion to their income, it will come to very less. While if I am a poor household and I need to buy a lot of bucket to store water, I need to spend 2 hours to queue at the public tap. The cost in comparison to my income or to my lost income, right? I can't work because today I need to wait for the tanker, is very huge. So the inequalities is not only embedded within the level of public provision, but it's also very strongly reinforced by the manner in which people are trying to compensate for the lower public provision. And I think I'm coming to the last section. Yeah, to the conclusion, which I think I'm on time, right? Yeah? Okay. How can we advance a right to the city if we believe this is important for all citizens to have the same right to the city and same right for services? As I said, I just put a few elements, maybe 3 or 4, and I hope you have questions for me and we can discuss this. Better use of policy instruments and modernization of the public sector, because I think this is important. I have argued over the years that private sector participation in India, especially for water supply, is not working, is not credible, is not going to happen. And if there is a change to happen, it will happen through the modernization of public sector. So, for instance, maintain solutions that provide subsidies, reduce collection fees, but many other things that can be done to ensure that slum areas or poor area are taken into account, which also means reduce leakage, improve your technical management of system. Of course, there are many directions to do that. Democratize access. Empower. Empower local councillors. They do play a role, actually, as I said, very informally. So if they were empowered to be much more proactive in decision making, maybe the arbitrage is correct in English, yeah? Arbitrage that would be done at the city level would be a much more sound and performing decision making processes. Recognize the potential of communities. I've not discussed this too much, but I think it is important. And some schemes which have worked, for instance, in Bangalore, were very clearly much more engage in recognizing the role of communities and also recognizing the role of lower level engineers who are in the field, what you call the frontline bureaucracy, which are the ones who actually spend their day negotiating with users. And often we don't look at their work because we are more focused on policies, but this is very important. Take into account the case of small towns because, as I said, this is really where urbanization is happening right now in India. It's a very major driver of the urban growth. So to forget small towns would be very detrimental in the next few years. And can you go over? Balance the role of engineers at the municipality level. What I meant here is that when you go to urban local bodies in India, you will see the dominance, if not exclusive dominance, of civil engineer, right? No social worker, no mediation cell, no community, except for some cities like Mumbai. Mainly everything is decided by engineers. And very clearly, as I've shown from that small example of Ramnagar in Mumbai, the manner in which the water access is shaped by the political economy, by the social norm, by the cultural norms, is something that a civil engineer cannot really understand it. And a civil engineer will understand, I have so much money, I need to just pump it into my network, and will not think of how he will have to negotiate with different leaders, how he could maybe plan it accordingly. These are just potential avenues for improving or advancing the right to the city, among many more. And I stop here. I mean, there was no question in between my talk, but I hope you will have questions now. So, I mean, I'm very happy to answer any questions you want to ask me. Yeah, sure. Yes, I can. So what I call compensatory strategies means that, for instance, I get water between, and in Delhi it's still the case. Okay, water will be provided with three dimensions, usually intermittent water supply. You don't get water the whole day, round the clock. You get water maybe 3 hours. I mean, it depends on cities, a certain number of hours per day, or sometimes even not every day, every alternate day. You will get low pressure. So if you live on a ground floor, that's okay. But if you live on a higher floor, usually the pressure will be less. And you also get low quality. These are the three factors of the water that is supplied. So I will try to compensate that as a household, right? If I'm a very wealthy household, I can talk about Delhi because I did a lot of survey, in fact. What I will do, I will have most probably well, and a system to pump up the water to my overhead tank so that I have water 24 hours. And if I am very wealthy, I don't even have to put on the pump. I will have a system that when the water arrives from the municipality, the water will be pumped and I will have water all the day, right? I can also have a system where I know the pressure is bad, so I have a pump. I put a small motor pump on the line, right? So if I am at the beginning of the street, I put my pump, I have good water, but the next one gets less pressure, so it has to put, right? So first, this has an impact on the network itself, right? Because if you have a lane which is full of motor pumps, actually you've transformed the network as it has been designed by the engineers. And third, I can use my AquaGuard or my reverse osmosis or whatever. Now reverse osmosis now is much more than it was, or I can have bottled water, etc., etc. Now, this can be costed, of course, and it costs a lot of money, especially now you need to go much deeper into groundwater. In Delhi, I think it was 25 meters, maybe 20 years ago. Now, I think some people go as low as 80 meters. And let's say it will come to, I forgot, but I remember at that time, I mean, the numbers are totally wrong, but I remember that it was coming to, on an average, let's say 2,000 or 3,000 rupees a year at the time when water maybe was, you were spending maybe 10 rupees per month, right? So you will spend much more than what you give to the public sector. But even this 3,000 compared to an income of someone who lives in Defense Colony or Panchshila Enclave will be less than 1% of its revenue, right? Now, if I am a poorer household, I also want to compensate. I also get very less water. So what do? I queue at the public tap, which has an economic cost in terms of, if we consider, of course, that's a discussion, that women's time has a value, which I guess you study. I see a lot of men here, but of course, women's time has a very important value. All right. I will also have to buy a bucket. I will boil water. So I will use the energy to boil my water because I know that my water is not very, I can taste it, I see the color. So this is also a cost. But in proportion to my income, that cost is often can reach 8, 9, 10%. Now, the World Bank in the 19th spent a lot of time saying that nobody should pay more than 5% of their income on water, right? So this is the impact of compensatory strategy. It means that not only your level of service is often lower, but that the cost you have to pay to improve. So actually, it's a totally regressive effect. That's what I meant by compensatory. Yeah. And have I answered your question? Yeah. Yeah.
What is the price of water bills that posh areas have to pay? So the water bills will be increases, the usual consumption of water will decrease, and the water that is left will be given to the poor areas. Why the government is not doing this? If they increase with water prices for posh areas, the water will be less, and the poor areas will get water immediately.
No, absolutely. This is one of the strong arguments about increasing of water price, that it will reduce wastage. If you pay more, then you will be much more careful of how much you use, right? So I normally the water pricing is, I think in some cities, you're right, it's based on property tax. So therefore, if your area is posher, then your property tax is higher. Your water bill is a percentage of property tax. But as you know, property tax has not been reformed very much. In many Indian cities, the property tax has remained at a low level. And when it is based on consumption, yes, it's exactly the idea of increasing block tariff. If I consume much more, I'll pay more. So that's the idea. But as of now, it still remains that most of the equilibrium comes from industrial users, and the water tariff for high income group is very less. Especially all of you, I think, would know how much you pay for electricity. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you live in private houses or in hostel. You live in hostels, all of you, houses with your parents. Ask them if they know how much they pay for electricity per month. They will know, but how much they pay for water, they might not know. But yes, I think that's one of the arguments that most economists have been put forward. And of course, it is one of the aspects to look at. But there's been a strong resistance to increase of prices. And for instance, in energy, when in Delhi, around 10 years ago, there was a very strong movement to increase electricity prices, especially for that, to ensure that you would have enough revenues to invest. There was demonstration all over the city to keep the price low. So there is also a culture of very low tariff. And what I was talking to you about compensatory strategy is also exactly how the economic instrument work with the perception, right, of the user. If I feel my service is low, or I need to compensate for it, I get, why should I pay so much more? So it's a bit of a hen and chicken kind of story, right? I need to first improve my level of services to say, here is my level of services. It's improved. See, you get better supply. So because I have made investment, because I've improved my services, then you need to pay more, right? So it's not only the idea that, okay, I increase the price, I will reduce the wastage. Is the acceptability of increasing the price is not only, is rooted in other factors as well. And no, I tend to agree with you. But what I was trying to say is that one needs to think of all these, various factors that can influence affordability and that can influence your ability to pay or your willingness to pay. I mean, you've done willingness to pay studies, I'm sure, in your work. Willingnness to pay is pretty low in India compared to many countries. Whichever comparative work has been done show that very weak in India compared to other East Asian countries, for instance. I answered your question? Okay. Oh, yeah, there's one there. Someone there.
Ma'am, how can you eliminate the water mafia in the major city? We read the articles just like water mafia aligning with the local authority and they are businessing the water. They are selling water illegally in poor area and many other areas. How can you eliminate the water mafia?
Well, that's a tough question. I'm not sure I can answer this one. Um, yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated question. So, for instance, that's what Mumbai tried to do in the 90s, 95, I think, or no, actually in the 2000, right? As I said, they decided to have prepaid water meter. And I think now it exists in many cities. I mean, I've not looked at it, which means that you have like your phone, exactly like your prepaid phone, right? You've paid for so much, and then when you have finished the amount you've put in your phone, then your services is stopping, right? So there was exactly the same idea that in some slum you could do that. People would know, so it would be affordable for them, and that because you would install this system, to some extent, they would lead to also an improvement of services, which would be affordable, and mafia would just disappear by itself.
Ma'am, but many villages we read in articles that mafia collaborate with the officer and doing their business.
Yes.
What was the solution, ma'am?
It's a very good question. I don't know if there's a solution, but you're right. No, you're absolutely right. Actually, in Mumbai, most of the privately supplied water supply system is actually linked to local politicians. So it is very difficult to, I would say, streamline in some sense the water supply because you come in competition. Let's say, even if the municipality was trying to improve the water supply system, yes, you have a lot of private actors. So very often, and I think you're totally right, sometimes, I'm not taking names, but, people like Montek Singh Luvalia would push for private water sector privatization, etc., which is very difficult because you can imagine a private operator coming into a field where, as you say, there is a lot of collusion and interest between local contractors, local subcontractors, etc. Well, actually, if you look at it, there is a lot of, I called it in my book, I think, I gave it a name. It's a small capitalism. It's a very small business operators that actually shape the water supply. Now, how to stop it? I guess invest in these areas for sure. Already make it a priority. Often they are not a priority. So, nature hates void, as we say. I don't know how you say it in English, but I can't give you a solution. But I think you're right. This is a very important understanding of how water is supplied, and there's been a lot of anthropological work in the last few years that have shown that. And that is one. There's also the fact that water is also a very strong tool of patronage. So even, let's say, if there is no mafia, MLAs and municipal councillors are allowed a certain amount of budget, discretionary budget. So what they will do, they will put water tankers, or they will put some form of services in which the link between access to water supply and clientelism, political clientelism, is very clear. And that you don't want to get rid of that because that's also a very strong voting bank that you're building around water. So, very difficult to... And depending on the power of that private interest in the city, they can be powerful and dangerous at times. In Mumbai, that's the case, for instance. Any other questions? Yes?
Hello, ma'am. A student has asked me a question yesterday, saying that, sir, some of the most drought-prone or water crisis cities like Bangalore and Chennai, they have such shortage, and yet when there is some event like IPL cricket, there's so much water waste on the ground. So is it the political will, or is it some other private place playing a role in that? Because even for political will, if you see, in the long term, like after maybe 2 elections or 10 years or 15 years, it will be a major issue for every political party. They have already depleted the resources. So how do we see this duality if we see where there is so much crisis of water and yet we have seen every year in the hottest months of the year that so much water is wasted for commercial activities?
I think this is typical political economy questions. Deployment of urban services has been very much influenced by elite and middle class, and I would say not middle class, but really elite. It's the same for water. It's the same for sanitation. It's the same for school. It's the same for health. With water, of course, the fact that you have a network can be a bit more of an equalizer sometimes because you need to have a technical deployment of your network. But often how it's been done in India, the systems are built for providing unreliable water supply, right? So even if I have my network, I pump into water castle, how do you call it? Water, the big water tank, right? And then I distribute a certain number of colonies. Now, if you look at the numbers, I was trying to look at those numbers. I don't know. I mean, it's old, but I think it's the same when I was doing my work long time ago on water supply in Delhi. Very clearly, the amount of water allocated to different neighborhoods is very different. And how do you explain this apart from the fact that the elite and the middle class has a lot of power to access state resources? Therefore, the question of right to the city is a very important factor. Because yes, you could say, but will everybody stand and say there should be no IPL because there is no water in the city and we would like to give this water to the poor? Have you seen any movement in this direction in Bangalore or Chennai? So I think the literature on urban political ecology is very much about that. And of course, it links strongly to the question of environment and to the question of resources and depletion of resources. We tend to think that access to resources is politically neutral, but urban political ecology work has clearly shown how I would say the power relations between different groups play a role. And for urban services in India, it's very clear that the middle class and the elite has the strongest power, access to the state, power of negotiations, and cities are not very powerful politically in terms of the Indian landscape. It is changing, of course, very rapidly. But till 10 or 15 years ago, the most important constituency are the rural constituencies. People in cities vote much less than they vote in rural areas. So even the political foundations, if you want, or political conditions to make sure that these kind of issues become prominent are not very much there. So people will push rather for real estate, and there's been so much of real estate speculation that's been very strong in the Indian cities in the last 10, 15 years, that you give priorities to this area. I think it's a simple political economic question, actually. But it's good that some people are starting to ask these questions. They are valid questions to ask, actually. Why do you want to have people wash their car every day? And Bangalore will have to soon, Cape Town. I think you must have read about Cape Town in South Africa 2 years ago. And Cape Town is a very, very, very wealthy city, clearly had to take very stringent measure. No more of watering your garden, no more swimming pools, a cap on how much you could use every day, whether you're rich, poor, white, black, yellow, or whatever it is. Because then the limiting resource. But India is a puzzle, let me tell you. It's an anecdote, it's nice to talk about this actually today. When I defended my PhD, which is a long time ago, that's why when Anuj said water, I thought, okay, but then I said, okay, why not? Let me go back to water a little bit. As I said, I was working on these compensatory strategies, and I calculated that 15% of the people I interviewed, I had a 600 or 700 sample, used borewell, right? And of course, this groundwater, you're going deeper and deeper and deeper. And when you go deep, you also transform the nature of the groundwater, right? I think some of you are in environmental sciences, so you would know that better than me. And someone asked me the question at the end of my defense that what would be the limit for Delhi? And I said, that's a long time ago, I tell you. There's a moment the resource will be a constraint. And see, where is it a constraint? In Delhi, it's still going on. Okay, in Gurgaon, Haryana, now they're a bit more careful. But still, the ability to exhaust resources to cater to a certain level of services and maintaining a very high inequality distribution of inequality is very strong. That's my answer. I don't know if that answers. Yeah? Okay. Good. Any more? No more? No young girls wanting to ask questions? No, I'm just trying to be careful about the gender balance of the questions. Important. That's all?
If they have any questions, we can.
Yeah, sure. I'm just happy to answer, but otherwise I'm done. I've done my. So I hope I touched upon a certain number of things.
Thank you, Dr. Zera, for such an insightful lecture. Now, I would like to invite Mrs. Pallavi Manchanda, ma'am, to deliver a vote of thanks.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of EcoSpire, the Economic Society of Shaheed Bhagat Singh College, I would like to sincerely thank all of you for being a part of today's session. First, a huge thank you to Professor Mari Ellen Zera for joining us and delivering such an eye-opening talk. The way you connected issues of inequalities, urban planning, access to water, and broader question of the right to the city was incredibly insightful. It gave us a fresh perspective on challenges we often overlook in our everyday lives. We are truly grateful for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. To our principal, Professor Arun Kumar Atri, thank you, sir, for always encouraging initiatives like these and supporting the academic curiosity of the students. Your presence behind the scenes makes all the difference. We are also grateful to Ms. Gurpinder Kaur, teacher in charge of the Department of Economics, for guiding us every step of the way. Thank you for always being approachable, encouraging, and invested in what we do. A special thanks to Mr. Anuj Goyal, the convener of our society, for his continued support and smooth coordination throughout the planning process. Your presence always brings a sense of calm to the chaos. And to Samiksha Singh, our president, you have led the team with dedication, creativity, and an eye for detail. Thank you for steering this event so smoothly from start to finish. Also, a big shout out to Arib and Pratyush, who have been handling all the on-ground coordination and queries. Lastly, thank you to all of you for joining us this morning, students, faculty, and guests. It's your presence and participation that makes events like these truly meaningful. Thank you, all of you. Thank you.
So thank you, everyone. Now we'll be starting with our events. We'll be having the case competition economics here, or C5, and we'll be having the economic competition in C1. Thank you. Before we disperse, just request the colleagues as well as here with us. I request all the